This is my first video with my new spectacles. Someone wrote to me and said that by getting new glasses, I have now changed my signature look. I didn't know that I had a signature look. The two most common comments about my new glasses is, number one, that they make me look like a hipster. And number two, that they make me look intelligent. So, smart hipster. That was the look, apparently, that I was going for. Anyway, let's do this. Hit the graphics. Let's go. We recently began a men's meeting at GCA. Every other Tuesday, we meet up at the church, and we've been collectively working our way through the book of Philippians. And it's been really good, really enjoyable, because Paul has a lot to say about fellowship and how a church body is to function in his letter to the church at Philippi. So we've been not only learning it, but trying to apply it to our own church life. Another thing I really appreciate about the men's meeting is that I'm not leading it. I get to just show up and participate, and other men from the church are leading it, so really good. Well, we finally got to Philippians 4, and we bumped into one of the most well-known verses in the New Testament. Unfortunately, it's really well known because it's really abused. It's the phrase, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." The NASB is, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Now, that phrase is used on t-shirts, it's put on banners, and unfortunately, it's used as if it is a complete thought in and of itself. What I mean is people ignore the context, because there is a context to Paul saying that he can do all things through him who strengthens him. Unfortunately, when it's just a t-shirt phrase, I've seen t-shirts that say, "I can do all things." And you have to look at the back of the t-shirt to see "through Christ who strengthens me." So it becomes like a braggadocious statement. I can actually do all things. I can do everything and whatever I want to do. Sometimes it's even used to excuse rebellious behavior, anti-Christian behavior. I can do whatever I want through Christ because he strengthens me. It's also the t-shirt of, strength teams, power teams that go around churches breaking bricks with their heads. And their phrases, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Well, these are all terrible abuses of what Paul was really getting at. Let's start by looking at the context, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Paul was getting at when he used that phrase. And then I'll throw in a little extra exegesis that I think will help us understand it even better and kind of cement or make obvious the context that Paul was talking in. So let's read the context. Starting in Philippians chapter 4, verse 10. "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now, at last, you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Think about the arc of Paul's life. He started out, by his own admission, a Pharisee, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, studied at the feet of Gamaliel. He had so much political power and authority that he was sent out to find people who were of the way, Christians, and then bring them back to Jerusalem to be tried, to be judged, and, like Stephen, to be killed. And yet, after his conversion, Paul suffered a kind of torturous lack that most of us have never encountered. I've never been beaten with even one lash for my Christianity, and yet 5 separate times he underwent beatings, 39 lashes. He suffered a day and a night in the deep, in the sea, and God protected him and kept him from drowning. He was stoned and left for dead outside the walls of Lystra. He was ultimately put in chains and taken to Rome, where he was imprisoned and then under house arrest, and then ultimately beheaded under Nero, according to best history and tradition. In other words, Paul knew what it was to abound. Paul knew what it was to suffer lack. Paul knew what it was to be fed well, and Paul knew what it was to go hungry. Paul knew what it was to feel safe and secure and politically connected. Paul knew what it was to be in prison. Paul knew what it was to be in chains. Paul knew the wide scope of experience in human life. He knew how to be abased. He knew how to abound. He knew how to be full. He knew how to suffer lack. But then he says this very interesting phrase, "But I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need." And what is the secret that he learned? Well, he learned that he could do all these things through Christ, who gave him the strength. Now, realistically, we like to think sometimes as human beings that it's only in times of suffering, only in times of struggle, that we really need Christ's help or power, that we need the assistance of the Holy Spirit, because we think that when things are going well, when everything's going great, we've got plenty of money and the wolf is away from the door, that we're self-sufficient. But in my own lifetime, I have known lots of millionaires. Back in my showbiz career, I knew plenty of people who were making lots of money. And I saw it destroy a great many of them. Paul is saying, through Christ, I was not destroyed by political power and wealth. God protected him. Christ sustained him. But then also, in the exact same way, Christ sustained him when he was being beaten. There's evidence in some of the things he writes that he may have even been losing his eyesight. He went through times of sickness, and yet on top of all that, just on top of all the physical problems, he had the care of all the churches. A phenomenal burden that Paul carried around, much more than any one man would ever be able to do. No one man is sufficient for the things that Paul was called to do. And so he rested in Christ. It was through Christ that he was able to do all these things, the good and the bad, the wealth and the power that can destroy men, and the lack and the hunger and the beatings that can destroy men. And he said, I found the secret to all of this. In fact, I'm always surprised by the word content. He uses the word content. He found contentment regardless of his circumstances. No matter what the circumstances were that he was going through, he was content. Why? Well, because he had the eternal perspective, where he recognized that this world is not our home, and that ultimately he was going to go be joint heir with Christ and live in eternal glory and splendor in a place where God was going to wipe away every tear. No more sickness, no more death. Well, when you have that perspective, when that's your goal, when you realize that all your hope is in the future, then whatever life throws at you, you can find the peace that passes understanding. You can find the hope that endures, and you have that ability to be content regardless of your circumstances. Why? Because as Paul said, I can do all these things through Christ. He strengthens me. So far from being a braggadocious statement or a self-aggrandizing statement, which is the way that that verse is far too often used, Paul was actually saying it in all humility. He was saying, it's not me. I'm incapable of enduring these things. Were it not for Christ, I would have been destroyed, and were it not for Christ, I would despair because of all the things I'm going through. But instead, he found contentment, and instead he gave all the credit to Christ. Now, little bonus hermeneutical point here. Let's talk about the word pas, the little Greek word that is translated all. I've talked about this and written about it on our website, and I've talked about it on some previous videos because you have to understand the way that the word pas is used by Paul and in Greek parlance and grammar. The word can sometimes mean every, all, collectively, but it can also sometimes mean all of a kind or all of a type. Here, let me show you an example. Writing to Timothy, Paul's son in the ministry, toward the end of his first epistle to Timothy in chapter 6, verse 10, the King James says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." That's become such a common phrase that we're all kind of familiar with it. The love of money is the root of all evil. It's an adage. People say it who don't even know their Bible, and they don't know that it's a Bible phrase. But hey, the root of all evil is money. But that's not really true. It's technically not true. For instance, Adam and Eve in the garden, their rebellion against God had nothing to do with money. There was no money at the time. So, that helps us understand contextually that the word pas here in 1 Timothy 6 isn't being used to say that the love of money is the root of every single evil that ever existed, and therefore the NASB renders it, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pang." Okay, that's really helpful. So contextually, you can figure out whether the word pas is being used to mean all or every, or whether it's being used to mean all of a kind or a type. Now, how do you differentiate it? Well, you look at the larger context. If the larger context contains kinds or types, that's a very good clue that when Paul or any New Testament writer uses the word pas or all, they're describing types or kinds. And that is exactly what you find here in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Starting in verse 7, he writes, "For we brought nothing into this world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." In verse 9, Paul described the various kinds or types of evil that men fall into because they want to get rich. And so that helps us when understanding the meaning of all or the meaning of pas in any particular verse. You just look for types or kinds. And that is a good indication that what he means is all kinds, all types. Now that's exactly what's going on here in the end of the book of Philippians. When he says, "I can do all things through him," I believe he means I can do all kinds, all types of things, because in verse 12, he actually did describe types and kinds of things. I know how to get along on humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. Those are all kinds, those are all types of situations or circumstances in which he has found contentment, and the secret to getting through them all is revealed in verse 13. I can do all these kinds of things through Christ who strengthens me. So, Context matters. The folks who have turned that verse into a t-shirt, especially a self-aggrandizing t-shirt, have completely misunderstood what Paul has said, and as people so frequently do, rather than let the Bible speak and tell its own story, they have segmented the Bible, found some positive-sounding phrase, and then applied it to themselves to make themselves feel good about themselves. But what Paul was doing was extolling the virtues of Christ, the power of Christ, the strength of Christ, and Paul's own incapability. He was able to be content through all kinds of circumstances because it was Christ who strengthened him through all kinds of circumstances. Well, I hope that helps a bit. And next time you see somebody yank that verse out of context and misapply it, hopefully you'll be able to take them back to the proper context and show them that Paul was not talking about dig me, watch me, look at me go, I can do everything because I've got Jesus. Woohoo! In fact, what Paul was saying is it's really all about him, and he has taken me through all of these things so that my dependency on him grows and my self-sufficiency is completely washed out and decreased. I'm nothing, he's everything. That's the point of that passage.